A newcomer arrives at the local auto repair garage, a place where life is a constant struggle. This new arrival is quiet and meticulous, yet his skilled hands possess hidden depths that might drastically alter the situation. You're simply here to fix cars, nothing more. Don't get any ideas about your importance, Kevin proclaims, believing he is the shop's undisputed boss. However, a dramatic shift occurs when a sleek black SUV pulls up and two men in suits emerge. I am James Harris, and I own this establishment, and 25 other shops just like it. Surprise, bewilderment, and apprehension fill the air. Everything they thought was permanent starts to fall apart. The new mechanic is no longer just a worker. He's now the potential destroyer of their current world. The moment for transformation has come. Now, he controls the fate of each person, deciding who remains and who is dismissed. His strength lies in his quiet nature. True respect must be earned, not demanded. James Harris knew engines better than most people knew themselves. For over a decade, he had worked with cars, mastering the intricate dance of precision, performance, and problem-solving. His hands, calloused from years of labor, had the kind of intimate understanding of machines that came from thousands of hours spent turning wrenches, adjusting carburetors, and tuning engines. He didn't need to look under the hood or plug in a diagnostic tool. The sound of an idling motor was enough to tell him where the problem lay. Machines, to James, were straightforward. They didn't judge, didn't care about the color of his skin or the assumptions tied to it. They just needed to be fixed, and he was damn good at fixing them. But people were a different beast altogether. James had joined the small-town auto repair shop 3 months ago, drawn by a desire to reconnect with the grassroots side of his industry. The fast-paced world of corporate-owned repair shops had lost its spark, and James was eager to get back to basics, to remind himself why he had started working on cars in the first place. He wanted to see the faces of the people who kept these shops running, to get a feel for the culture that built a business from the ground up. What he hadn't expected, though, was the undercurrent of tension and skepticism that followed him the moment he walked through the door. To most of his co-workers, James was just another mechanic, quiet, diligent, and unassuming. They didn't know that James owned the shop they worked in, along with over 24 others spread across the state. He had intentionally kept his identity a secret, choosing to observe how his business operated from the ground level. He wanted to see the shop for what it truly was, not as the owner, but as one of the team. What he saw, however, often left him disappointed. From the very first day, he could feel the weight of judgment in the air. It wasn't overt at first, more subtle, a whispering glance here, a hushed chuckle there, but it was there. Kevin, the shop's lead mechanic, was the first to make his disdain known. Kevin had worked in the shop for years, and in his eyes, James was just another newcomer, someone who didn't belong in his carefully established world. "You're the new guy, huh? Great! Grab a wrench and try not to screw anything up," Kevin had said on James's first day, barely glancing up from the engine he was working on. James Harris was a man whose knowledge of engines surpassed most. He'd dedicated over a decade to the automotive realm, achieving mastery in the precise blend of accuracy, performance, and problem-solving it demanded. Years of labor had toughened his hands, giving them an innate understanding of machinery, born of countless hours spent on repairs, carburetor adjustments, and engine tuning. He didn't need to peer under the hood or connect a diagnostic tool. Merely the sound of an idling engine was sufficient to pinpoint the source of an issue. To James, machines were transparent. They offered no judgment and paid no heed to his skin tone or related presumptions. Their sole requirement was repair, a task he was exceptionally adept at. Humans, however, they were an entirely different entity. Having desired a return to the grassroots aspect of his trade, James had joined the small-town auto shop 3 months prior. He found the breakneck tempo of corporate repair shops devoid of allure, and he longed to revisit fundamentals, to refresh his memory as to the motivation for his initial car work. He sought to observe the individuals sustaining these shops, gaining insight into the culture that formed a business from its origin. What he hadn't anticipated, however, was the undercurrent of apprehension and doubt that accompanied him from the moment he arrived. Most of his colleagues regarded James as a typical mechanic, quiet, diligent, and unassuming. Unbeknownst to them, James was the shop's owner, alongside over 24 others he possessed across the state. Intentionally, he'd kept his identity undisclosed, choosing to observe the operational dynamics of his business from the ground level. He aimed to perceive the shop in its genuine form, not as an owner, but as a member of the crew. Yet what he observed often caused him disappointment. From day one, the burden of judgment permeated the atmosphere. It wasn't instantly overt, more subtle, a glancing whisper here, a hushed chuckle there, but its presence was palpable. Kevin, the shop's head mechanic, was the first to make his disdain known. Kevin's tenure at the shop spanned years, and in his view, James was merely another newcomer, one who didn't fit into the established environment he maintained. "So, you're the newbie? Fine, just grab a wrench and try not to make a mess," Kevin had said on James's first day, casting a fleeting glance away from the engine he was working on. James wasn't fazed by the lack of a proper introduction or the clear implication that Kevin expected little from him. He simply nodded and began working, the shop's ambient sounds mingling with the cadence of his own actions. He wasn't aiming to cause upheaval. His purpose was to observe, absorb, and demonstrate through his deeds that he deserved his place. Soon enough, customers began to notice his fastidious attention to detail. They could see that James was more than just a mechanic aiming to punch a time clock. He took pride in his work, correcting errors overlooked by others, offering helpful suggestions, and it didn't take long for some of them to specifically request his assistance. Word inevitably spread. James's reputation, although quiet, began to change the balance of the shop. He became the trusted mechanic, the one capable of diagnosing issues others missed. Unsurprisingly, this didn't sit well with Kevin. "Don't get the idea you're something special just because some customers like you," Kevin had said one afternoon, his voice steeped in condescension as he wiped his hands on a rag. "This is my shop. Don't forget that." James didn't engage in the bait. He remained silent, as he often did. He'd weathered far worse than Kevin's arrogance. Much worse. He'd encountered people who judged him based on his origins, his attire, his introverted demeanor, and his unwillingness to conform to others' expectations. Early on, he'd learned the world wasn't always kind to those like him, people who didn't neatly fit into other people's notions. However, Kevin's words had a different weight. They weren't solely about power. They originated from something deeper, something James had spent his life rebelling against: dismissal. Kevin's attitude wasn't simply dismissive of him as a mechanic. It belittled him as a person, something James would never accept. James's inner fortitude originated from his unwavering knowledge of himself and his abilities. It was a lesson his parents instilled in him from childhood. Dignity was impervious to external forces. It was an inherent characteristic, one you carried with you, regardless of the hardships life presented. He carried this lesson daily, a constant reminder that his self-worth was not defined by others' opinions. Even when the world attempted to disprove it, he held fast. Kevin's words carried a sting, yet James wasn't concerned. He knew the system. Influence was not merely about being loud or forceful. It hinged on consistency, on being unwavering, even in the face of hardship. Rather than directly confronting Kevin, James persisted in doing what he did best, putting in his utmost effort, executing his job with skill, and allowing his outcomes to be the speaking force. Eventually, the rest of the team took note. The shop, after all, comprised mechanics, individuals who valued skill and precision, and James's expertise was undeniable. However, he was fixing not only the cars, but also the shop's culture. Gradually, the respect James earned from customers began to permeate the workplace. His colleagues, initially dismissive, started to recognize his profound experience and the caliber of his work. While Kevin remained a challenge, it became evident that James was there to stay. James was not merely repairing engines. He was restoring something more fundamental: how people saw each other. And that was, above all, the most important repair of all. Weeks passed, and the undercurrent of tension in the shop grew stronger with each passing day. Kevin and two of his closest co-workers, Mark and Paul, began targeting James with subtle jabs and jokes that were anything but funny. They mocked his methodical approach to repairs, calling him slow-mo behind his back, a nickname meant to belittle his precision and carefulness. "Hey, James," Kevin called out one afternoon, loud enough for everyone in the shop to hear. "You're not trying to reinvent the wheel over there, are you? Customers don't pay for philosophy. They pay for speed." Laughter erupted from the others, but James barely acknowledged it. He remained focused on the engine in front of him, meticulously tightening a bolt to the exact torque specification. Words meant little to him when his work spoke volumes. He knew his craft better than anyone in that shop, and he didn't need to engage in their childish antics to prove it. The disrespect didn't stop there. During lunch breaks, Kevin and his friends would exaggerate James's supposed mistakes, turning them into punchlines for their cruel humor. They'd imitate his calm demeanor, mock his quiet voice, and even question his knowledge in front of customers. They went out of their way to undermine him, hoping to chip away at his confidence and disrupt his quiet composure. "I'm just saying," Kevin remarked one day as the team gathered around the lunch table, "not everyone's cut out for this kind of work. Some people are better off fixing toasters." The others laughed, but James didn't flinch. He knew that rising to their bait would only fuel their behavior. Instead, he let the comments roll off his back like water off a duck's feathers, his focus unwavering. He didn't need their approval or validation. He had a job to do, and that job was more important than their petty mockery. Every part he handled, every system he repaired, became an extension of his resilience. Each task he took on, no matter how simple or complicated, was a quiet statement that said, "Watch me prove you wrong." But the tipping point came when a particular customer walked into the shop one slow Tuesday afternoon. The door chimed as it swung open, and in walked a middle-aged white man with a sharp gaze and a dismissive demeanor. He scanned the shop floor with a practiced eye, taking in the details before his eyes narrowed in on James, who was wiping oil off his hands near the front counter. "This guy working on my car?" the man asked, his voice loud and pointed. His tone carried an air of superiority, as if he couldn't fathom the possibility that someone like James could work on a car. "Because if he is, I'll wait for someone else. I'm not taking any chances." Kevin smirked, eager to indulge the man's prejudices and, in doing so, further cement his position in the shop as the dominant figure. His gaze flicked over to James, then back to the customer with a knowing look. "Don't worry, sir," Kevin replied, his voice laced with false reassurance. "I'll make sure one of our top guys handles it." The words hit James harder than he let on. He had dealt with racial prejudice and assumptions for much of his life, in ways both subtle and overt. It was nothing new. But this time, in the presence of a customer who chose to openly express his biases, the disrespect felt sharper, more deliberate. And for a moment, James could feel the urge to respond, to call out Kevin's behavior or confront the customer, but he didn't. Instead, he said nothing. He simply returned to his workstation, jaw tight, and resumed working on a brake system. The clink of his tools on metal filled the silence, a constant reminder that his expertise was undeniable. He was used to these moments when the world seemed determined to judge him by something other than his skill. He had spent years learning to keep his head down, to focus on what mattered, and to let his actions speak louder than any words could. It wasn't the first time he had encountered this kind of treatment, and James knew it wouldn't be the last. He had learned long ago that people like Kevin and customers like this man would always exist, people who saw only what they wanted to see and who judged others based on their own narrow perceptions. But this time, something inside him clicked. This time, he decided would be different. That evening, after the shop closed, James stayed behind while the others packed up and left. He didn't mind the quiet solitude. The shop, now empty of customers and the chatter of his co-workers, felt like his space to think, to reflect. He pored over the paperwork, reviewing the customer records and the operations he had observed throughout the day. There were notes to be made, observations on the inefficiencies in the workflow, the way Kevin ran the front desk, and the subtle undercurrents of tension that had taken root in the shop's atmosphere. As he worked, he made mental notes on the attitudes that had been festering among the team, the lack of respect for each other, the way some were allowed to dominate while others were undermined. James knew that if he didn't act soon, this culture of toxic behavior would continue to grow, infecting everything it touched, from the quality of the work to the morale of the employees. He could feel the shift coming. It was time to take control, not just of the work, but of the environment. If he wanted this shop to thrive, it couldn't just be about fixing cars. It had to be about fixing the way people treated each other. James wasn't just an observer anymore. He was ready to lead, to show his team what respect really meant, and to prove, once and for all, that he wasn't someone to be dismissed. That night, as he locked up the shop and headed home, a new resolve settled in his chest. The next day, he would begin to make the changes he had been quietly planning. It was time to turn the page, to take a stand not only for himself, but for every person who had ever been underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed. And this time, he wouldn't just prove them wrong. He would make sure they couldn't ignore him any longer. Lack of accountability. He knew change was needed, but it had to happen in a way they would never forget. The next morning, James arrived at the shop earlier than usual. The sky was still a soft gray, the air crisp with the promise of a new day. The faint scent of dew hung in the air, and the streets were quiet, save for the occasional rumble of a passing car. James stood outside the shop for a moment, taking in the stillness, feeling the weight of what he had to do next. The world around him was calm, the quiet beauty of the morning contrasting with the storm that had been brewing within the shop for weeks. It was the perfect moment for a change, a clean slate, a fresh start. After a few moments, he took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and stepped inside. The interior of the shop was familiar. Tools hung neatly on the walls, the workbenches lined with various parts and machines. But today, everything felt different. By the time Kevin and the others arrived, James was already deep into his work, humming softly to himself as he fine-tuned an engine. The sound of the wrench turning, the click of components fitting together, seemed almost rhythmic. His calm demeanor masked the anticipation building within him, like a quiet storm gathering strength. Every turn of the wrench, every adjustment to the components, felt like a countdown to the moment he had been waiting for. The others began to trickle in, just as they always did. They went through the motions, grabbing coffee, chatting about last night's game, commenting on the weather, but James could tell that something was different in the air. His presence, though still steady and unassuming, felt like a silent pressure, a tension that neither Kevin nor the others could put a finger on. They had no idea what was coming, but James did. And today, he was ready. At precisely 10 a.m., the low hum of an approaching vehicle broke through the usual din of the shop. The sound, though familiar, felt unusual in its weight. It grew louder and louder, until it became undeniable. The staff looked up, curious but unaware of what was about to unfold. A sleek black SUV pulled into the lot, its polished surface gleaming under the late morning sun. The staff paused, exchanging glances, their confusion mounting. The vehicle's doors opened with a smooth, almost surgical precision, and two men in tailored suits stepped out, their polished shoes clicking against the asphalt with a quiet authority. They walked directly past the bewildered staff, their movements deliberate and commanding. There was an air of importance about them, something the others could sense but couldn't quite place. Without a word to anyone else, they approached James, who was still working on the engine, his hands steady and his expression calm. One of the men extended his hand to James, his face set in a mask of professionalism. "Mr. Harris," one of them said, his voice clear and authoritative, "the contracts are ready for your review. The board has signed off on the expansion." Kevin's jaw dropped. His face, which moments before had been set in its usual smug expression, now contorted in shock and confusion. He blinked rapidly, as though the scene unfolding before him didn't quite register. His eyes darted between James and the suited men, trying desperately to piece together what was happening. The others, too, stood frozen, their curiosity piqued as the realization began to sink in. This wasn't just a visit from some corporate representatives. It was something much bigger. "Wait, what's going on?" Kevin stammered, his voice faltering, lacking the self-assuredness it had carried in previous exchanges. The confident bravado that had once defined his demeanor had evaporated, replaced by an almost childlike bewilderment. He glanced around the room as if seeking an explanation from the other employees, but no one had answers. Everyone was as stunned as he was. James, however, was unfazed. He set down the wrench he had been holding and wiped his hands on a nearby rag, his movements slow and deliberate. He stood up straight, his posture unyielding, and turned to face Kevin. The calmness in his demeanor was the only thing that stood out against the sudden tension in the room. There was no hesitation in his eyes, no doubt in his voice, just a quiet certainty that made everyone in the room hold their breath. "I think it's time I properly introduced myself," James said, his voice steady, carrying the weight of years of experience and quiet authority. His words cut through the stunned silence like a blade, and the entire shop fell into a heavy stillness. "My name is James Harris, and I'm the owner of this shop, and 25 others just like it." The room fell into absolute silence. The rhythmic sounds of tools and machines ceased as every pair of eyes in the shop fixed on James. It was as if time itself had stopped. Kevin's face turned ashen, the color draining from it as realization dawned on him with the force of a thunderclap. His confidence, built on arrogance and misplaced superiority, crumbled in an instant. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He stared at James as if seeing him for the first time, a man he had dismissed and belittled now standing before him as someone far beyond his reach. The other employees exchanged nervous glances, their earlier camaraderie replaced by unease. The quiet confidence James exuded made them rethink their own behavior, their previous judgments. It was clear now. James wasn't just the quiet mechanic they had underestimated. He was the one who had quietly but firmly built an empire while they had been content to live within the confines of their limited world. The air itself seemed to shift. It became heavy, laden with the weight of unspoken consequences, the realization that nothing would ever be the same again. No one dared to speak at first. The silence stretched on, stretching the moment out until it felt like an eternity. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, Kevin managed to speak again, but his voice was thin, almost pleading. "Wait, you own all this?" Kevin muttered, disbelief still clouding his words. His arrogance, which had once been a shield, now left him exposed, vulnerable. James's gaze didn't waver. He looked at Kevin with a calm intensity, his voice low but firm. "Yes, Kevin," James replied, his words carrying the weight of finality. "And I think it's time we had a conversation about respect and how this shop is going to operate moving forward." The words hung in the air, and for the first time since James had walked through that door, the staff seemed to understand the full extent of his presence. James wasn't just a mechanic, they had underestimated him in every way possible. And now, as the realization sank in, the true power of his quiet authority was clear. The days of arrogance, disrespect, and complacency were over. It was time for change. The tension in the room was palpable, the atmosphere charged with a new sense of purpose. Whatever had been allowed to fester in the shadows had now been brought into the light, and James, ever calm and composed, had made his stand. The future of the shop, and perhaps of the employees themselves, would be determined by the choices they made from this point forward. But for now, James simply turned back to his work, his hands steady as he picked up his wrench once more. The battle had been fought, and in the silence that followed, the shop had already begun to change. James didn't fire everyone, not immediately. Instead, he called a meeting in the break room that afternoon. The air was thick with unease as the staff gathered, their conversations fading to nervous silence as James stepped forward. He looked calm, but his posture radiated authority, his gaze sharp enough to cut through the tension in the room. "I didn't come here to embarrass anyone," James began, his tone steady and deliberate. "I came here to see how this business runs when the owner isn't around, and what I saw was disappointing." The weight of his words settled heavily over the group, and a few of the employees shifted uncomfortably in their seats. James paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to underscore his point. "Respect is not optional," he said, his voice firm but not raised. His eyes moved deliberately from one face to the next, ensuring his words reached everyone in the room. It's not something you reserve for people who look or act like you. It's the foundation of any successful team. And without it, this shop has no future. The words hit like a hammer. Kevin, sitting near the back, fidgeted, his face flushed with irritation. He opened his mouth to respond, but James raised a hand, the gesture as commanding as his tone. "Save it," James said curtly. "Actions speak louder than words, and your actions have told me everything I need to know." For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was deafening, the tension palpable. Then James took a deep breath and continued. "This isn't just about today or this week. It's about the culture we're creating here. A culture where everyone feels valued, respected, and supported. If we don't have that, we don't have anything worth fighting for." The meeting ended without further discussion, but the unease lingered. By the end of the day, Kevin and 2 other employees had been let go, their termination papers handed over without fanfare. It was a sobering reminder that James wasn't making empty threats. For the remaining staff, James gave a simple ultimatum: embrace a culture of respect and accountability, or find work elsewhere. To emphasize his point, he outlined a new set of expectations, clear, firm, and uncompromising. Weekly check-ins were implemented to ensure progress. Anonymous feedback forms were introduced to give employees a voice, and James made it clear he would be a regular presence in the shop, not just an absentee owner. Some staff members felt a glimmer of hope amidst the discomfort. For the first time, they saw the possibility of real change. Others weren't so sure, but one thing was undeniable: the days of complacency were over. James left the shop that night knowing the battle for its soul had only just begun. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like it was a fight worth taking on. Word of James's story spread quickly, not just through the shop, but throughout the town. It didn't take long for the community to catch wind of the way he had handled the prejudice and disrespect that had been directed at him. At first, it was just whispers, passing mentions at the local diner, conversations among regular customers at the shop. But soon, people began approaching him, one by one. They sought him out, offering quiet apologies for their earlier assumptions. Customers who had once ignored him, or worse, treated him as less than, now looked him in the eye and spoke with genuine respect. The ripple effect didn't stop with the customers. Word spread among the staff, too. The same co-workers who had once mocked him now began to reevaluate their behavior. Kevin, Mark, and Paul, who had once seen him as a target, started to fall into line, realizing that James wasn't someone they could push around or dismiss with ease. Slowly but surely, the toxic atmosphere that had once plagued the shop began to shift. It wasn't a complete overhaul overnight, but it was a start. Employees who had once ignored each other's contributions now began to treat one another, and their customers, with the dignity they deserved. There were no more snide comments during breaks or passive-aggressive jabs as the workday went on. Instead, there was a growing sense of camaraderie, a shared understanding that the shop would only thrive if everyone worked together, and that mutual respect was the foundation of any successful team. Customers, too, noticed the change. The shop, which had once felt like a place of friction and tension, now exuded a quiet professionalism and warmth. Word got around that James Harris wasn't just an expert mechanic. He was a man who demanded, through his actions, that people treat each other with the same care and respect he brought to his work. For James, the experience was bittersweet. On one hand, he felt a sense of satisfaction. His quiet resolve, his refusal to bow to the prejudices thrown his way, had made a tangible difference. But it wasn't just about proving a point to Kevin or to anyone else. It was about setting a standard. He had always believed that true leadership wasn't about wielding power or dominating others. It was about leading by example, inspiring others to be their best selves. And in the face of adversity, James had done just that. But James also knew that the fight against prejudice and ignorance was far from over. This victory, though significant, was just one battle in a much larger war. The subtle assumptions, the biases people carried, these didn't disappear overnight. and they certainly wouldn't be erased by a single act of defiance. But James had come to understand something important. Change starts with small victories. It starts with one person standing firm, refusing to be silenced, and in doing so, showing others that it is possible to create a different kind of world. As he stood in the shop one evening, taking in the new energy that had begun to permeate the space, James realized that what had begun as a quiet rebellion against prejudice had turned into something much more. It had turned into a shift in the culture of the entire shop. It wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges ahead, but the change was real. And in that little shop, on that ordinary stretch of road, James Harris had won a battle that was anything but small. It wasn't just a personal victory, it was a collective one. The shop, the employees, and the town had all taken a step forward. And though James knew the road ahead would still be long, he also knew that this was how change began, one step at a time, one small victory at a time. As he locked up the shop that night, the sound of his tools clinking together as he packed them away felt different. It was no longer just the sound of a mechanic finishing his day. It was the sound of a man who had helped create something better, something stronger. It was the sound of progress. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more like it, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. What did you think of James's journey? Drop a comment below and let us know how you'd handle a situation like this. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you want to see how the story unfolds further, or if you have ideas for the next chapter, let us know. The journey doesn't end here. Thanks for watching, and remember, change can come from the unlikeliest places. See you in the next video.